this is gonna sound so cheesy, but I saw it more of a rebirth rather than a death, like a ego death. Yeah, because I mean, she's so young. She's at a transitional part of her life for everyone right there. Right? She just got out of high school and now she has to enter the like, all right, what do I do now? Like, how do I make money? Where am I gonna live? What do I want to do? What am I gonna do to get there?
Welcome, friends, to episode 318 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey.
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
And this week we discuss Terry Zwigoff's 2001 film, Ghost World.
And joining us again, this time for an end-of-class public art show, is graphic novels editor Jasmine Amiri. Jasmine's career has spanned 13 years working for multiple publishers, including Oni Press and Boom Studios. She now works as the graphic novel reviews editor at the School Library Journal. Welcome back to the show, Jasmine.
Thank you. I'm very excited to talk about the movie.
Yeah, me too.
And this was the one you said you saw first, so it's fun to come full circle here. What do you think on this viewing? Did you feel like this is still one of your favorite movies? Did your viewing change? How long had it been since you've seen this?
Definitely at least 15 years. It has been a while. Yeah, I'm not going to lie. I was cringing at certain scenes.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it was really interesting having read the comic first in such a long time and then watching the movie, how similar and yet how different the two are. Because as I was reading the comic, I did remember like certain things that happened in the movie and how they, like Luke was saying in the last episode, combined certain characters. And I did think it was interesting how they kind of took the same themes from the comic and then altered the way that they explore them in the movie.
Totally. And I think having Daniel Clowes do the screenplay here, it really lends itself to an interesting adaptation. Excited to get into that, but I did want to pause for a moment. And just in case anybody didn't listen last week, just give you a chance a little bit to talk about yourself, Jasmine, and like what work you do for School Library Journal, that sort of thing.
Yeah. So I started working for School Library Journal actually exactly 1 year ago. And
Congratulations. 1 year to the day?
Almost. It was yesterday, I think it was the 15th.
Wow. Congrats.
That's exciting. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. But yeah, I mean, I was editing comic books for different comic book publishers up until then. And then I kind of, after I stopped working at Oni, I kind of wanted to switch things up a little, but I still loved editing and I still loved comic books. So this opportunity presented itself and I applied, and it was just such a good fit from day one. And yeah, it's really interesting being on the reviewing side. And, you know, I feel like I get to really advocate for comics now, and I get to really represent the people who I've gotten to work with on the publishing end. Like, I know how hard people work, how long it takes to make a single comic book. So I'm trying to make sure that that comes through and that, you know, librarians are able to get these, you know, so many of the purchasing decisions do depend on these types of reviews. So I'm trying to review as many of these books as possible.
And I assume you review, or I guess people review, and it comes out in the magazine, reviews of a lot of stuff for children and younger readers, right? That's what we talked about last week.
Yes.
Would this fall into that umbrella? Would this be considered something that might be reviewed, or is this too adult?
This is probably too adult.
Okay.
You know, things that are more college aged are always a fine line. Like last year we reviewed a few, but like we reviewed Roaming, which was by the Tamaki sisters, and it's also kind of more mature, and it's about college aged girls going to New York for the first time. But yeah, it really just depends.
Interesting.
Yeah,
because this is that bridge, right? Like, it's all about that transition between childhood and adulthood, which we touched on last week, but definitely at the heart of this movie, too.
Yeah, and I mean, everyone's always, you know, it's like middle school students are always reading books about high schoolers, and elementary are reading about middle schoolers and so on. So,
yeah,
you know, it is good to still have offerings for YA that are about older people.
So I also wanted to ask, last week we talked about your background is in film and that you were a film major in college. And I wanted to ask if like that affects your career now as you're looking at reviews, because of course in film school you're watching a lot of films and probably thinking of them from a critical eye. So besides making you like an amazing teammate on trivia games, what does it do for you nowadays?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still editing a couple, not as much as I used to, but a couple comic books. And so in my film school, I focused on cinematography, which just means you take a couple more cinematography classes than anything else. But you know, it's really funny. Like one of the big arguments that is in comics specifically is like, do you know what like the 180 degree rule is? Where it's like,
James, you have talked to me about this, and I have forgotten how to explain it, but I know that this came up in one of our episodes before.
Yeah. Basically like trying to avoid jump cuts in the edit.
Exactly. And one of the big discussions is like, is that still applicable in comic books? And that's one of the things where I'm always like, oh my gosh, the cinematography brain that I still have from film school, it bothers me so much. But it is kind of hard to like be like, is it going to bother an audience member as much as it would if it was in a film? But yeah, I mean, besides that, it's, you know, I feel like I am really using my degree every day, just in a way that I would have never imagined.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I mentioned last week like how it just makes so much sense to me to go from one visual medium to the other, knowing composition and understanding like even just something as basic as like, you know, layering, textures that you can create, depth, that sort of thing. Like that's going to be huge for someone who's like looking at comics with a critical eye to try to refine them and to, you know, make them as appealing as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is kind of interesting how much whenever a comic book is adapted into a movie or TV show, how much they use in the storyboards. And I mean, you could even see it in Ghost World, where some of the scenes were, you know, verbatim and the same shots and everything. And same with, you know, movies like Scott Pilgrim or a bunch of like Marvel movies do that. And, you know, obviously I hope that they pay the artists that essentially did their storyboards for them for free, but
yeah. It's funny when I think about, or I guess growing up when I would think about comics adapting into film, I would often think like, it's a storyboard, it's right there, just do that on the page. But like knowing what I know now, it's there's so much more to it, and there's so much that like when you bridge that like when you go from one medium to the other, there are strengths to each of them. And it's interesting too because Clowes, when he approached this film, he tried to do like a 1-to-1 kind of just move the words over from the comic book into final draft and create a screenplay based on that. And he realized that it didn't work. It didn't play correctly. And then he like sort of made an entirely different like story version of this, like kind of reimagining of the story, and then blended the two to work to basically create the screenplay that we get here, that he works with Zwigoff on.
yeah.
That's really cool. I love that approach.
It's also, I've never actually read one of Daniel Clowes' comic book scripts before, but in general, comic book scripts have so many more directions than you're supposed to put into a screenplay.
That's interesting. That makes sense.
Because you need to tell the artist what to do, you have to tell the letterer what to letter, you have to tell the colorist everything. And because, you know, it's kind of like I said in the last episode, like the artists are the actors. Yeah. So instead of like directing, you're essentially directing through the script.
Well, I mean, in this situation, Clowes was doing all of that. Like he lettered himself, he did the coloring, he did the art himself, and then he did the screenplay himself. So he's wearing all of these hats, and he's trying to. And I actually think it's really a credit to him that he realized that it wasn't going to work as a 1-to-1 thing. Like it would have been easy or even understandable for him to be like, it's just going to be a 1-to-1 adaptation of my comic. And sometimes that doesn't work out. Like we famously covered the Watchmen adaptation, which was pretty slavishly beholden to the way that the comics looked and trying to replicate that on screen. And yet we argued that there were certain things missing thematically and subtextually from that adaptation that were present in the comic. So that doesn't always mean you're going to have a great adaptation. And so this was cool to see him kind of reimagine it and approach it from a whole new storyline with Seymour. Let's use that to talk about our general thoughts here early before we get into anything else. James, me and you, first time watching. I'm curious, what were your thoughts watching this thing?
I had so much fun with this movie. It immediately evoked like a certain style and tone that it's very nostalgic for the 90s, and it, like, in a way that kind of lulled me into this sense of like, oh, I've seen teen films from the 90s before, but so quickly establishes like it's not that kind of movie, and like steps away from the typical, which I think is smart too, because you're kind of roping audiences in with that. The performances were really standout for me. Thora Birch as Enid, totally captured that character from the comic book in a way that I understand why we sort of deviate from it being like a two-hander in the comic where we get so much of Rebecca and so much of Enid, shifting to just Enid here. It's because like Thora is just like evoking that character in such a captivating way. And maybe that's to put a lot of credit towards her, but I just thought she was great. It was probably smart on Zwigoff's part to work with Clowes to write a story that kind of did focus in more on one of the characters. Now, I still feel like their relationship had that sort of emotional through line that we talked about last week, as far as like friendships sort of fizzling out. But seeing like Thora Birch and the Steve Buscemi character, Seymour, and their relationship being like sort of the heart and the middle of this movie, and the way that Enid is seeing herself reflected in like Seymour, maybe like somewhere down the line, depending on the path she chooses in life, she could end up with like someone like Seymour. And it's not that that's a bad thing. It's just that she sees that as an option. I read that they went out of their way, along with cinematographer Afonso Beato, to evoke comic books in this film, but not in the way that they had seen like X-Men done or Dick Tracy, where it's like very literal and it kind of like takes it and makes it cartoony and like way over the top. They wanted to like kind of show the other side to comics that I think they respected a lot. So Beto really took to heart the idea of crafting a comic book in a visual style and film. So he studied the colors and the style of comics, and then oversaturated the final film, purposely redolent of, quote, the way the modern world looks, where everything is trying to get your attention at once. Which when I read that, I was like, of course that's what they were trying to do. It's so pop, like saturated, colorful, popping. Again, that level of detail and that attention to trying to evoke what Clowes initially intended, and then also like what works in film. It's eye-grabbing in a way that you wouldn't expect for a sort of indie film like this. It's more like you would expect this of like a big blockbuster, and instead it's like these are just characters in Anywhere America wearing very colorful clothing, and I did like also that they had some of those in jokes as far as like names of stores and some of the comics that we see throughout, threaded in there as kind of like visual references.
I was actually thinking about what you said last week about how Daniel Clowes wanted it to kind of look like blue, like in the way of the sunset and everyone's TVs are glowing, and it reminded me of I Saw the TV Glow, that movie that just came out.
Oh yeah.
And I was like, I wonder if this movie came out now, if that would kind of be the look of it.
I haven't seen that yet, but I know you really loved that.
So
James,
good.
Did you see it?
No, I haven't seen that yet.
It's perfect.
I'm going to check that as high praise. I'm going to check it out. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I remember when I was watching this now after 15 years, I remember that one of the first things that I also responded to was just how poppy the movie looked. I love Enid's room. I wanted her room. I thought it was really just beautiful, and like the way that every color really does pop. Like when, I don't know if you noticed, but she has really weird colored lipstick on the whole time.
Yeah.
Like
the green was particularly striking. Yeah.
At first I was like, I don't like that. And then after a little while I was like, oh, it's actually kind of interesting. Yeah, it's okay.
I mean, I think it fits the character.
Yeah,
it fits the
totally.
character
No,
for
I
sure.
just meant like, I was like, oh, I don't like the look. But then I was like, actually, you know what? It kind of works.
I read that Zwigoff actually that room was based on a room that he had growing up.
No,
He had, like,
that
some
was,
of the
I read that too. That was Seymour's room.
Seymour's room.
So yeah, which was also quite striking in a different way. His secret like record room. But that is a testament to the set design, which was just really great throughout, and I thought like it was a huge attention to like background details, things like that, which we commented on in the comics. And yeah, I think just the overall sense of like we're gonna tell a more traditional story in shape, but we're gonna like play with a lot of expectations for what people expect for a teen movie, because this was sort of an anti-teen movie. At first it seems a certain way, and then you quickly realize no, we're not getting that kind of movie. I love that feel to it. And seeing Steve Buscemi here as taking on the role of the potential like love interest in this kind of movie is so strange. And I think a little thorny with, looking back at it today, but I get what they were going for with him being this oddball. Again, we talked about this last, like kind of a example for what life could be like for an oddball as an adult. I think for Enid. So I think it makes sense that she is attracted to him, and that he's attracted to her. But of course, then there's like all kinds of reasons why this probably shouldn't happen. And so it becomes tricky, and I think that can make interesting art, right? As we talk about like why it plays out the way it does. I think that's something we should return to as we go through the plot here.
It's definitely one of those situations where like it's meant to be very like off-putting in a way that we maybe don't agree with, but life is messy. I think it's obviously clearly weird to have this kind of a relationship with someone who's barely out of high school.
Yeah. Now I read that Zwigoff designed Seymour to be kind of a self-insert in some ways. Like a lot of his hobbies are the same as Zwigoff's, and like that's cool. But then you like think about what plays out in the movie, and he ends up, hooking up with this teenager. That's a little strange. So
a bit of Zwigoff wish fulfillment here. It seems
and like I don't know if that's what's happening, but you kind of read that once you find that out.
You mentioned some of those hobbies, and mainly the large one is collecting records, right?
Yeah.
He's collecting 78s, which I like to collect records, but there's levels to it, right?
I wanted to ask you about this because you're the guy I know who collects vinyls. I think at least people I know well that is like really into collecting it. And I was watching this going, I don't know what they're talking about. I wonder how much James is following here.
Oh yeah, no, I for the most part understand. It's just I don't have for one, I don't have any 78s, which are basically just like the rotations per minute. You have your 33s, 45s, and then 78s. 78s are definitely more rare. So then you can also see he has 1,500 78s in his collection, and they're all very well curated. Yeah. I don't have that as much. I collect a lot of like film scores.
Just the bare essentials, he says.
Right. Yeah, he's parsed it down to that. But seeing these like the group of collectors get together and the way that they're like talking about it, and there's the one guy who's like, that I only collect like S plus or whatever he was saying
the grading
the condition of it. Yeah. And a random David Cross cameo there as a creep.
Oh yeah, that was. Do you collect or do any vinyl collection, Jasmine?
Or listening to vinyl? It's not just for collection.
Sure.
Yeah. I do. It kind of started with my parents. I had this one Valentine's Day where I was like single, and they just kind of showed up to my apartment with like a huge stack of records that they bought for me, and they were like, this is like this old Dolly Parton album that I used to love.
Solid.
And that kind of started it, and then from there it just kept growing, and every time I'm in a record store I usually walk away with one or two, but I admittedly have one of those awful I need to actually get a good record player, because I'm happy with my record collection, but the actual method of playing it is awful.
Everyone will tell you if you have one of those little suitcase ones, they're gonna damage your vinyl. It's gonna weigh on them too much and stuff.
It's like a half step up from that, but essentially the same thing.
That was what I started with, and like I knew if I had a friend who was very into it, and they were like mad at me. They were like, you gotta change this. I was like, okay, all right. Look into it. It's actually, and for those who are interested, it's not as expensive as you would think. That's what I'll say about it.
Okay.
Well, collecting the vinyl is, but the actual players themselves are not as expensive as you think.
Well, fully knowing that we're doing the very thing that party was doing to our listeners probably right now, I feel the call of collecting vinyls, and I think as soon as I live in a place with more room, it's one of those hobbies I can feel that I might fall into. So we'll see how that goes. But because, it seems like it could be something you spend a lot of money on. But let's move on from vinyl collection. I think that is emblematic of the love of weird things, right? Like these oddball hobbies, collecting things, the things that attracts Enid to Seymour in the first place, is that he is a strange person. And that's why I thought Steve Buscemi being cast in this role is perfect. And I read somewhere, I saw these like factoids about this movie, that the studio initially wanted like Russell Crowe and Harrison Ford to play this role. And Zwigoff wanted Buscemi from the start, and it just shows how much like the studio was not understanding what this movie was supposed to be. They wanted NSYNC and Britney Spears for the soundtrack. There was like certain things they had no idea what they were doing.
Definitely fits. That fits perfectly. Yeah.
They were like, we want like modern music that teens are into now, you know, and like he was like, no, we're not gonna do that. But yeah, Buscemi. I also thought it was really cool that this movie came out July 2001. And many people probably know this story, but I just love that Steve Buscemi was in New York during 9/11, which would have been only a few months after this movie came out. And literally...
Wasn't he a volunteer firefighter?
He had been a volunteer firefighter years previously in New York City for, I think, 5 years. And then he went on to become a movie star, right? But because he was formerly a firefighter, he basically called him up and was like, can I help? Went and rejoined one of his, I think his engine that he had worked with before, or whatever they call it, and was doing search and rescue for, I think, like a week or something, like immediately following September 11th. So, like, the guy's a badass. I have a lot of respect for him, and it's cool to see him in this moment, because this is, like, right when he would have been doing this, basically.
You mentioned some of the studio not understanding the film, and I'll start off by saying they felt it wasn't easy to sell to mainstream audiences. According to Zwigoff, one executive suggested we have a bus at the end with the destination art school spelled out on it.
Yes.
Another suggested a double wedding where Enid marries Seymour and Rebecca marries Josh.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. So props to them for resisting studio meddling, because this did feel like it didn't compromise on its vision, at least in ways that I could notice.
I was wondering a lot about that, and I don't have any answers, but the whole time I was wondering, the fact that they took so many of the themes and kind of remixed them for the movie, how much of that was because of they wanted to Hollywoodify it? Like, did they feel like they had to give Enid a love interest and that it had to be Seymour?
I suspect that Clowes, and I did not read this, so this is just me riffing, but I suspect that he realized that the movie he was coming up with was similar enough to a teen movie, like to the classic teen coming-of-age movie. And so he started to look at ways that he could, like, conform to that and then subvert it. And so that's my suspicion, is that he leaned into, like, we're going to set this up like it's a teen movie that people might be familiar with, but then I'm going to undermine it in all these different ways. And how much of that was on purpose versus just like he happened into it, I don't know.
Well, I like that we're talking about Steve Buscemi and that he's kind of a sweet guy, because
and a badass.
It turns out that he was uncomfortable with this role, as I feel like you would be. So every day when they were done filming Seymour, he would immediately change his clothes, so he looked completely different. Like, he wanted to kind of distance himself from the role in a way where he's like, I think he just wanted people to know he's not Seymour. So, power to him.
It's interesting because I do think that I think I kind of thought that the whole point of his character was that, Enid was very obsessed with, relics of the past, and Steve Buscemi kind of is a relic of the past, and he's also obsessed with nostalgia. And I think that's one of the big themes of the movie, is an examination of nostalgia and whether it's good, bad, and whether, just something is old, just because something is old, does that mean it's good? But I think that even though, he is a relic, and he's, this older guy who's talking to a teenager, he is unapologetically himself, and he's kind of like resigned to remain that way and remain how he is. But much like Steve Buscemi, I don't think Seymour likes himself. And like, he even says like that he doesn't want to end up with somebody who's like him, and that he hates his own interests.
At one point, she says, I'd kill to have a room like this, or I'd kill to have this kind of lifestyle. And he's like, well, go ahead and kill me. Because it's like, I don't feel like there's a lot going on over here.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's like, does he feel that way because no one's ever sort of validated it for him? And it's always been more of a burden. Because now all of a sudden Enid is showing interest in it. And it seems like he is sort of reinvigorated and excited about his hobbies again. And of course, like, that's one of the main differences between her and the woman that he starts dating, Enid, is that she is dismissive of the hobbies, and maybe she puts up with it, but she doesn't seem interested. And that's one of her, like, the major indictments on her, I think, that Enid has, why Enid maybe doesn't like her as much. I like what you're talking about with, like, him as being this relic of the past, because Enid is so ironic. Like, and like, literally, like, she engages with everything from a place of, like, detached irony. And so she doesn't, it's like not cool to like anything. We talked about this in the comic, right? Her and Becky just go around just sort of like sarcastically deadpan humor about everything. Everything's bad. Something's so bad it becomes good. But then she's like, no, it's so bad it became good. And then went right back around to becoming bad again. Like nothing is cool. Nothing is good. But I think that also is like a commentary on like modern pop culture. So Buscemi is from a different era. And so it seems like maybe things were cooler back then, or maybe something that's just not like modern pop culture for the time of this movie could be perceived as more authentic. And it seems like there's like a real desperation on Enid's part to find authenticity in a world that she seems is just like so fake.
And like in a strange way, I think that Steve Buscemi's character is like the most punk rock character in the entire movie, because he's the only person who's really being true to himself in the face of everything that culture is telling him to be. He's literally the definition of counterculture, because nothing about him is cool, and he's okay with that, and in that, he's cool in a way.
I like that. Yeah, he's like the real punk rock, because like the other guy she interacts with, who was the fake punk, right? Who's now like, you gotta go into business if you want to be punk rock. And that's when she like decides to wash the green out of her hair. Mm-hmm. She's like, screw this.
There's a level of sincerity that I think that is just missing from her life, where she's turning her nose up to the world. Everything is lame. And while this person is genuine, they're also like sincere, and they're also like wholly themselves. I often felt like she was trying to find some level of like genuine sincerity that she could believe in the world, because everything else felt like bullshit to her. And he kind of represents that.
He genuinely loves his hobby, right? Like, and that's something that she doesn't have anything that she genuinely loves, but he genuinely loves collecting these records. He has a real affection for them, and I think she admires that. Also, I feel like a lot of people can identify with the idea that like this is a particular time in one's life where you tend to make some really bad romantic decisions, and a lot of us have some of our worst. I know I did. So the idea that she makes some maybe questionable romantic decisions at this time in her life, I think totally tracks too, with like real experience people have.
One of the things that really strikes me in this movie is the way that it approaches art too. The art teacher, and how she talks about like art has to mean something, and has to have substance. It has to have like some sort of hook to it. She's trying to tell Enid like what art has to be, and in that way stifling the art that Enid is creating. And I found that to be like an interesting commentary that the filmmakers were digging into there.
Let's return to that, because I think that's a big topic, and it does strike at some of the heart of what this movie's talking about. But yeah, the art school stuff, the nature of comics as art. But before we go too far into the plot, maybe you got some more production stuff you wanted to talk about.
To talk about Terry Zwigoff a little bit, he's an American film director whose work often deals with misfits, anti-heroes, and the themes of alienation. He first garnered attention for his work in documentary filmmaking with Louie Bluey in 1985 and Crumb in 1995. After Crumb, Zwigoff moved on to write and direct fiction feature films, including the Academy Award-nominated Ghost World in 2001 and also Bad Santa in 2003. And I did want to note, this is the first comic or graphic novel that was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay.
Oh, cool.
At the Academy Awards.
Really?
Yeah. Wow. Zwigoff moved to San Francisco in the 1970s and met cartoonist Robert Crumb, who shared his interest in pre-war American roots music. Zwigoff, who plays cello and mandolin, joined Crumb's string band, R. Crumb and his Cheap Suit Serenaders, with whom he recorded several records. Zwigoff's friendship with Crumb led to his involvement in the underground comics, with an X, scene. He initially edited the one-shot Funny Aminals #1, the groundbreaking comic in which Art Spiegelman first introduced the characters and themes that would become Mouse.
Love that. By the way, Mouse is amazing.
It is really good. That actually came up, I think, last week, right, Jasmine? You were kind of giving us some of the background of like comics with an X versus comics, graphics, novels kind of thing.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Crumb, I think, specifically got named.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I noticed there was like a record, I think, of that group, I guess he was a part of, Like they hold it up at one point, and he's like, "That's not very good. Like, put that down."
When she's flicking through Seymour's records, the first one she pulls out is actually R. Crumb and his Cheap Suit Serenaders. Yeah. And yeah, Zwigoff was in that band, and the Seymour's like, yeah, you won't like them. They're not very good, which is just amazing. That's awesome. In 1972 to 1973, Zwigoff operated Golden Gate, a small retailer and underground comics publisher. Golden Gate Publishing released 3 comics during this period, all of which heavily featured Crumb's work. One was called The People's Comics. The second one was Turned on Cuties. And the third one was Artistic Comics. Zwigoff later sold Golden Gate's publishing rights to Kitchen Sink Press.
Dennis Kitchen.
I don't know what any of this means, but I see Jasmine's reacting to everything.
Yeah.
I know. I'm vicariously living through you because I don't know these specific ones, but I assume that they're pretty groundbreaking. And for Zwigoff, a filmmaker or eventual filmmaker, to start in this world, it's like the inverse of what you did, right? Like he's starting in comics and eventually he moves into film, and you started in film, swapped it. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very cool.
2 ships.
Zwigoff began his film career making documentary films, starting with 1985's Louie Bluey, a 1-hour documentary about the blues and string band musician Howard Armstrong. Zwigoff had been inspired to locate and interview him after listening to a 30s recording, State Street Rag, on which Armstrong played the mandolin. Zwigoff worked on a documentary about R. Crumb and his 2 brothers for 9 years, during which Zwigoff said he was, quote, averaging an income of about $200 a month and living with back pain so intense that I spent 3 years with a loaded gun on my pillow, trying to get up the nerve to kill myself.
Dark.
Pretty extreme. So comics with an X for sure.
Yeah.
Is what he was involved in. He completed Crumb in 1994. The critically acclaimed film won the Grand Jury Prize at the Sundance Film Festival, among numerous other awards from various festivals. Additionally, Gene Siskel named Crumb the best film of 1995, as did over 10 other major film critics. When Crumb failed to receive an Oscar nomination, there was an outcry from the media which forced the Academy of Motion Pictures and Sciences to revamp their documentary nomination process that previously had been dominated by the distributors of documentary films. So, changed the industry.
There you go.
For the better. It seems like made it more accessible to smaller documentaries.
Yeah.
So as we've said, Zwigoff worked closely with Clowes. They actually co-wrote the screenplay together. And Zwigoff made sure to add in his individual vision to the adaptation, particularly in his capture and editing of languid, lingering shots, a technique derived from his experience as a documentarian. Another notable touch is his minimal use of extras in the film, making the city and its streets intentionally empty. Clowes notes approvingly, quote, "It captures this weird feeling of alienation in the endless modern consumer culture."
Did you? So I'm not good at noticing background actors, but did you notice?
You're going to talk about the pregnant woman? Yes, I did. I did notice.
She just takes a deep drag from her cigarette.
There's that really emotional scene where they're trying to see if they want to rent a place together, Rebecca and Enid.
Oh, okay, yeah,
and in the background, there's a pregnant woman walking by, just smoking a cigarette.
I did not know that. Somehow I missed that. Wow.
Because there weren't many extras in the film, it felt so it was so striking. Mm-hmm. It was just like so in your face, and I was like, "Wait, is that a pregnant person smoking a cigarette?" Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it's a striking.
What kind of commentary is that? Do you think that was a directed note, or do you think that the extra went rogue and just decided to smoke a cigarette?
That seems directed to me.
I mean, if I was like in the art class and this was my presentation, I would say like, "Oh, I think that's commentary on suburbia and how Enid is rejecting it."
Yeah.
You know?
Well,
that,
and they're in that. I mean, that scene. They're going to tour a place that Enid does not approve of, and the first thing they see is a man with like a walker. But then, like that being in the background, I think is just further evidence that like this is an area Enid does not want to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to talk about the soundtrack. Jasmine, you mentioned last week, I think you discovered the soundtrack first that led you to all of this, right?
Yeah. And, going back and listening to it and watching the movie, I realized that, like, my favorite song on the sound in the movie is actually not on the soundtrack.
Oh, okay.
And that I had burned a CD that I, like, illegally downloaded.
Of course. That's super punk rock Enid of you.
Yeah, it was very 2001 or 2002 of me.
Yeah.
Yeah, shout out to Bearshare.
Nice.
That's I have.
I haven't heard that name in quite some time.
Oh yeah. But I I had, is it like Muhammad Rafi is like the opening song, and then I had
That song is so awesome, by the way.
So
Like,
cool.
God.
That dance
sets the
number.
tone. It's
Yeah.
like I don't know, like groovy rock, but it's like in the 60s.
Yeah.
Very cool.
It reminds me of stuff that you would find on like a Tarantino soundtrack.
Totally.
Sure.
And that
Yeah,
dance
100%.
sequence it felt like so modern. But it was like from the 60s when I was looking into it. I was like, oh, wow, it's really cool.
Supposedly it's from a Bollywood musical called Gumnam. So I can't help but feel like if I had seen this movie around the time that you did, Jasmine, if I saw it as an early adolescent, I absolutely would have made this my identity too. Like, this is like, I already was like, you know, touching on some of this style and like the music and the counterculture of it. But like, man, this would have been like, it would have hit me so squarely. It's funny because now looking at it, I see it as sort of like a time capsule, whereas then I would have been like, because these are the people I really looked up to. Like, I remembered thinking, we were clearly millennials, but like I thought Gen X were like the coolest people ever. And like talking about generations is such a broad thing, but yeah, in general, I thought that like I really loved their like don't give a fuck attitude, and that's reflected in this film. And then clearly, like as an adult now, I look at it and I'm like, it's a little quaint because you know, I realize that there's so much more to the world than just like telling everybody it's bullshit.
Well, and that's kind of what the movie's about too, though, right? Like
Yeah.
about how like, yeah, you can be so detached and ironic and dismissive of everything, but like ultimately that's kind of an empty way to live. And so, yeah, I think that leads Enid astray, you could argue.
Yeah. One of my favorite movies growing up was Empire Records. And my
Yeah.
favorite character was Deb, who's like the girl who shaves her head and kind of has like a buzz cut the whole time. And I remember when I watched this movie, it kind of felt like it was like a movie that just starred Deb, and it was kind of like exploring that personality. But it is also a cautionary tale. And I feel like Seymour, Steve Buscemi's character, is kind of a cautionary tale for Enid, because they really are the same person. Like in the same way that like if you watch House of the Dragons, like the two Targaryens are kind of.
Are you talking about like Aemond and Daemon?
I think Damon and Rhaenyra.
And
Damon
Rhaenyra.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's kind of like, oh, like they're kind of the same person, but different genders and the age gap. That's kind of how I felt about Seymour and Enid. But less dragons.
If there wasn't the age gap there, you would think that they would align so well. I mean, I think that's Seymour. That's what he wants to happen. But Enid also is kind of like, she's exploring the world, whereas Seymour has like experienced it and he knows where he's at. And so somebody who's that sort of like flexible, I guess, in their like exploration of themselves, and like they're still trying to find themselves, it just feels very, to me looking at it, it just feels so like predatory in a way, because he is helping form who this woman will become in a sense.
Yeah.
And that's like a really strong power dynamic, obviously.
I want to talk more about this relationship, but I think we should wait until we get there in the plot, because I do want to lay that out for people who maybe haven't seen the movie in a while, like remind everybody what happened. So if you're ready, I think we should dive into that.
Best friends Enid and Rebecca face the summer after their high school graduation with no plans for their future other than to find jobs and live together. The girls are cynical, social outcasts, but Rebecca is more popular with the boys than Enid. Enid's diploma is withheld on the condition that she attend a remedial art class. Even though she is a talented artist, her art teacher, Roberta, believes that art must be socially meaningful and dismisses Enid's sketches as nothing more than light entertainment. The girls see a personal ad in which a lonely man named Seymour asks a woman he met recently to contact him. Enid makes a prank phone call to Seymour, pretending to be the woman and inviting him to meet her at a diner. The two girls and their friend Josh secretly watch Seymour at the diner and make fun of him. Enid soon begins to feel sympathy for Seymour, and they follow him to his apartment building. Later, they find him selling vintage records in a garage sale. Enid buys an old blues album from him, and they become friends. She decides to try to find women for him to date.
So the introduction of these two, Rebecca and Enid. We haven't talked about Scarlett Johansson yet as Rebecca. I read that she was only 15 years old at time of filming for this movie, whereas Birch was 18, and that actually affected like how often she could shoot. And I wonder if that had an effect on how many scenes they had together, because I was a little struck by like how little interaction they had by comparison to the comic, where it felt like this movie was almost equally about Enid and Seymour as it was about Enid and Rebecca, whereas that's definitely the focus of the comic. Much more about their relationship.
Yeah, I mean, Seymour's not even a character
Yeah,
really
exactly.
in the comic, and yeah, I that was one of the big I think negatives for me. I think is how much more we're focused on Seymour and Enid's relationship rather than Enid and Becky, because I think their relationship is more interesting and more nuanced.
I did kind of miss it, for sure.
Yeah.
And again, I wonder if the shooting schedule might have had an effect on this, but they didn't seem to have very many scenes. But the ones they had were good, and I could see why Zwigoff cast Johansson. Obviously, goes on to become one of the biggest movie stars we have these days. This role was interesting for her. She was very kind of deadpan, not emoting a lot or anything, but I also read somewhere that she was drawn to the role because she liked the way it portrayed the teenager character. It wasn't like a lot of other like teen dramas or teen comedies that she had been seeing screenplays for. And I totally get that. Yes, very, very different material here.
The refocus on so I see it more as like a refocus on Enid than obviously Seymour has a much larger role or a role that has been created and is a larger character than Rebecca. But I liked getting like the perspective of Enid and kind of going into her a little more because I just imagined this film as Rebecca and Enid, and it just feels like you're not able to explore sort of the character who really even in the comic took center stage to me because she's the one who's kind of pushing back against what is like adulthood, saying like her adulthood is coming on, and Rebecca seems to be like embracing it at every turn and trying to like pull her friend along with her, which is definitely something that happens. People sort of mature at different rates like this. I think that it still held some of the emotion as far as the friendship breaking up, but not nearly what I got in the comic. And while I like kind of I miss that. It would have been cool to see that adapted in the film. I feel like this focusing on the Seymour stuff kind of really recontextualizes like a lot of what we've been talking about up to this point, which is Seymour being the future version of Enid.
I did also, I thought it was interesting that they kind of kept in that dynamic where Becky is kind of all talk, no action, whereas Enid is the opposite, or like every time Becky sees like a kind of pathetic man, she says, "Oh, I want to do him," or like, "I want to make love to this guy." And then Enid, in the movie at least, actually follows through.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
And she's the one who's like, "I'm going to tell him you said that." Like,
exactly.
Yeah. Which is right out of the comic, admittedly.
It was. I mean, yeah, that's one of the scenes where it was like shot for shot.
Mm-hmm.
But it was also very just kind of crazy to see Scarlett Johansson's voice coming out of a 15-year-old version of Scarlett Johansson. Like, she still had that husky, great voice.
Speaking of other characters that were added, we get the introduction to Josh working at the convenience store and this guy with nunchucks who just shows up.
Wait, he's in a Red Hot Chili Peppers music video. He was like an early 2000s like icon.
Heartthrob or something.
No, it was like. Do you remember like the New York like underwear cowboy guy? He was like one of those, but in Los Angeles.
Oh, and the guy who like that's who this really is, or is he based off of that guy?
No, like that's him. I think it's the By the Way music video by the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Okay. He's like the crazy driver who does I think like fireworks or nunchucks. He like kidnaps Anthony Kiedis.
Nice. It's been a while since I've seen Red Hot Chili Peppers music videos. I got to get back into this. Yeah. Love the band. I don't watch a ton of music videos anymore.
But yeah, I mean, really interesting sort of comedic relief character, swinging nunchucks around, keeps getting in fights with the guy who owns the shop. And then, yeah, he'll come back again later when Steve Buscemi tries to like go confront Josh. And Josh was also funny in a different way. So meek, and like it was funny how he kept kind of getting dragged around and then getting caught up in the drama that they were causing, and like he like didn't want to do any of it. And the fact that like Buscemi goes to confront him, I thought was particularly funny, because he doesn't even like know what he's talking about. I don't know if he remembers him or not. Maybe he does, but like the idea that he was somehow responsible for what happened is so laughable.
So while we're here, because I will forget about it if I don't mention it now. Did you guys know that there's a post-credit scene in this movie?
Oh, I did. I read that. I actually went and watched it on YouTube because I did not stick around, to look for a post-credit scene. Are you aware of this, Jasmine?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, so at the end of the movie, I think it's more of like an outtake that they decided to like leave in. It was like a funny thing that Buscemi did, but basically like during that scuffle, during that fight, it's like a different perspective on it. And Buscemi like fights back and like beats them up and was like, "Fuck off! Like get off of me!
Don't fuck with me!"
Yeah. And like he like beats them and walks out of the store instead of getting like beat and put into the hospital.
Yeah.
I honestly, that was like the only part of the movie that kind of confused me, was because I didn't think he got beat up that bad.
Yeah,
and then
I guess the implication is the choking was worse than it seemed. Because otherwise I'm like, why is he in the hospital? This seems ridiculous. But then they also didn't like highlight like any sort of damage to his neck or anything. But like, of course, if you get choked out, you could end up having to go to the hospital. Of course, I think that was the implication. I don't know, or maybe they just sent him there to like check on him. I don't know.
It would make sense though that there might be like a deleted scene and then there's more.
It was
fighting.
funny. I agree, James. It kind of seemed like an outtake or something because I think there's somebody laughing in the background of it when it happens.
Yeah.
So
I thought I heard that as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to progress the plot a little bit more, and mostly because I want to talk about this art stuff that we've mentioned.
Yeah.
Enid has meanwhile been attending her remedial art class, and she persuades Seymour to lend her an old poster depicting a grotesquely caricatured black man, which was once used as a promotional tool by Cook's Chicken, which formerly had a more racist name, where Seymour works in corporate. Enid presents the poster in class as a social commentary about racism, and Roberta is so impressed with the concept that she offers Enid a scholarship to an art school. Seymour receives a phone call from Dana, the intended recipient of his personal ad. Enid encourages him to pursue a relationship with Dana, but she becomes unexpectedly jealous when he does so. Enid and Rebecca's lives start to diverge. While Enid has been spending time with Seymour, Rebecca starts working at a coffee shop. Enid gets a job at a movie theater so she can afford to rent an apartment with Rebecca, but her cynical attitude and reluctance to upsell concession gets her fired on her first day. The girls argue, and Rebecca abandons the idea of living with Enid.
That was definitely one of the cringe moments for
the
me.
The art school stuff?
Yeah. Again, I think that this is kind of playing on that theme of like examining nostalgia. We really romanticize the past, I think, and we do kind of hand wave or forget about all of the bad things in the past. And I don't know if you knew this, Luke, but that was actually a real restaurant, and there's only 3 in the world, and one was here in Portland.
Wow. And so the history described in this movie is accurate?
It actually never went on to be the Cook's. It was just the original slur name. And it was like the same artwork, same everything. And it's actually, it was opened in 1931 and it closed in 1949. And it's where Clyde's Prime Rib currently is, which is amazing because the Clyde's is like one of the last Black institutions in this town. Like if you go there on a Friday or Saturday, they're just playing great jazz music and everyone's hanging out and having a great time in the jazz bar in the back.
Wow. I did not know any of that.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. I didn't either until I clicked on the Wikipedia for it.
For this episode?
Yeah.
Wow, okay, new information. That's really interesting.
What's interesting about that too is like I felt like there was something being said there about like whitewashing and gentrifying and like it having that name and then turning into Cook's and then kind of just like moving on from any of the dirty past that it had to be the successful franchise, and then Seymour working there and kind of like I think in his own way like kind of grappling with that and kind of trying to remember some of the rougher edges and things like that. Now what Enid does is interesting when she brings it to school, because then it's being propped up as this like artful thing that she's trying to call out racism in some way. But I also felt weird about that because it does feel like using something like that to become successful as a white artist with depictions of racist imagery and stuff like that, those caricatures. So a lot of rough stuff that we navigate through here.
Yes. So this is a fascinating part for me. I kind of loved this part just because it was so interesting. this art teacher is, at first I thought like, oh, this is a fun class. Look at this wild lady. She has this weird film that she shows that's like hilarious.
Awesome.
And she's so serious about it. And I was like, I would like to take a class like this. This seems fun, you know? And she wants them all to like fulfill their like, you know, their artistic selves. And Enid at first seems like she really doesn't like the lady. I'm like, oh, come on, Enid. This lady's cool. She's authentic. But then I think, I think Clowes is trying to show some of the downside of this is when you have someone like that making these kind of arbitrary decisions about what is and what isn't meaningful art. And that's what we get in one of the next scenes, which is, of course, like totally was cringy for me and like, you know, just reminds me of a lot of stuff you'll encounter in the writing world when discussions come up about like genre versus literary, what is valuable art and what isn't, what is, you know, fluff and entertainment. Of course, you know, he's using some broad examples, right? Because there's a guy there who has drawn basically fan art for a video game, like Mr. Mayhem or somebody's like hitting somebody with an axe in the head. And like, she identifies this as like meaningless entertainment and then equates that with what Enid had been doing in her journals, which is like comics essentially and cartoons. And clearly, like, especially some of the pages that get shown, more meaningful ones. But it seems that the teacher is unwilling to recognize that because she just on the surface looks at it and says, this is the same kind of thing because of the medium, right? So there's like almost a discrimination against the medium coming from the art teacher here, which of course is awful. And I think, you know, a comics artist is clearly behind this trying to like say, like, look at what happens. But then of course you bring in all these elements of social commentary, and it was interesting the sort of attitude the film seemed to have towards that, and how it seemed like we were supposed to be sneering at these people who were trying to make social commentary with their art, right? And like, look how ridiculous this is. The woman who has the found art piece that she's made, and it was notable that all of it seemed to be around feminism and around pro-choice, and like, it felt uncomfortable because it seemed to me that these male screenwriters were sort of positioning these people to seem ridiculous and for us to be against them, which also seems like a bad thing to do to me. It's sort of engaging in a similar dismissiveness just against a different medium. So it's a tricky subject, and I thought a fascinating one to explore.
Yeah, I mean, I thought that the teacher was supposed to be kind of silly and dumb.
Yeah.
I think that they made her look stupid.
He said that he based her off his real middle school art teacher. It was like revenge.
That makes sense to me because to this day, I mean, I work for School Library Journal, so my entire job is kind of this, where it's really just changing people's perspectives on graphic novels. And they can be educational. They can absolutely, they have a place in the classroom and they have a place in libraries. And I think that the whole point of this character is that the art teacher is that she's chaotic, and you don't know if she's going to respond positively or negatively to anything. And I don't think that she even knows. And she's not a good teacher. She didn't actually teach them anything. She just had them do whatever they wanted and then just gave her opinion about it.
Definitely. Yeah. She forced her opinion onto everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the people in the class start to conform to that. I think that's the implication. And like outside of what she does, the implication that the woman in the class who's making the coat hanger art sculpture and stuff like that, like she's maybe just doing this because she knows that the teacher's going to like it. And so she's being kind of a suck up in that sense. But maybe she actually does find value in the art she creates. I don't know. But I think the movie wants us to think that this is like empty.
You said it was a reaction, Luke. I'm curious if the movie, because I kind of didn't read it as if you make art that has social commentary, it's like something that we should laugh at or whatever, you're taking it seriously. I kind of read it as like their reaction to, it doesn't just have to be that. And especially in a medium where people were like actively saying like, this is not art, we don't classify this in the same way. I felt like they were saying, because this art teacher is seeing what Enid's doing and saying this is fluff, this is bullshit. I felt like they were in kind of making fun of the other stuff that she is specifically catering and saying like this is high art. I think at one point she even says. I think that was their attempt to say like not that they don't like art with social commentary in it, but that typically that's what's propped up as good. And in this case, like, you know, everything, there's a place for everything.
No, and I don't disagree with that either. And the examples that were given were like so ham-handed and over the top, right? And so of course, like the idea that this is somehow great is kind of laughable because it's like it's so over the top and in your face. But of course, like there's also places for art like that. But the idea is that now all the students are just trying to appeal to her in some way. And in fact, like the one guy who's just making weird sculptures in the background, maybe he's the one who's like engaging with it in the most authentic way. And I thought it was funny that she just like destroys his sculpture at one point, trying to like give him a hug because she doesn't care. Because like, you're right, she is a terrible, I think, art teacher here at the end. But yeah, I mean, I think this is all interesting in the way that she brings in this found piece, as she calls it, right? Because she is a white woman and she is doing it to please the teacher, it seems, on some level, but maybe some element of like she wants to expose this piece of the past and like bring it to the modern world, in sort of referencing what Buscemi had talked about or Seymour had talked about. But again, like I think that there's also a cautionary tale here about how like powerful pieces like this in the wrong hands can just almost be, I don't know, like not destructive, but like, yes, it gets people talking, right? And it gets in the newspaper. But also like the teacher keeps insisting we should hear from the artist, but like, that's not how most art is consumed. Like it needs to stand on its own. So like, I think there's something inherently flawed about this piece. Like it needs to have some sort of context that it doesn't seem to have. And I don't know. It is kind of darkly ironic that the like one black person who mentions that this is offensive, like we don't ever return to them and what they might think about this, right? Like we just focus in on the character who brought it. It's just such a thorny subject, and like, yeah, the idea of like a white woman bringing this in and trying to adopt this as like a meaningful piece of art is inherently strange to me. I don't know.
I think the thing that strikes me is the first found art piece that we see is something that's like been altered, right? It's like a teacup that has a tampon in it, right? That's like her found art. And then we get this other one. She hasn't altered it in any way. She's just showing it, as if, again, she didn't do anything with the art other than, you know, curate and bring it there. So to me, that's where it felt even more like that's not your piece of art in any way.
Show the new logo of the chicken joint with this one like behind it in some way, shining through or something. Like do something that shows the context you're implying. She doesn't do any of that. And in fact, she isn't even there at the art show.
Yeah.
That whole storyline kind of reminded me of, did either of you see American Fiction?
Yeah.
Where,
we might cover that at some point, so I was waiting.
Was that based on a book?
It's a book called Erasure. Yeah, it actually just made the new like 100 best books the New York Times put out. Erasure is like pretty high on that list, apparently.
As soon as I watched it, I was like, man, Luke has to see this because it has a lot to do with like the publishing industry as well.
I've been waiting because I thought we might cover it at some point.
But yeah, I mean, it reminded me of that where it's like, you know, if we're constantly rewarding people just for bringing, you know, what they think of a certain race or something, or like with how they want to view racism, that's, you know, that's like a cheap version of art. It's not like actually art.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can move on from this art stuff, but I think it is kind of at the heart of how Zwigoff and Clowes want us to look at this movie, because it is both a comic book adaptation about a comic story, but also trying to engage with art on all these other levels and be, you know, like a serious film in some ways, even as it is also a kind of a teen comedy, right? And so it operates in both spaces. And I love that stuff. Like I love genre work that is clearly sci-fi, fantasy, horror, whatever, what have you. But it's saying something really interesting and profound, because I always see those kind of writers getting dismissed because of the genres they write in. So I think it's a fascinating conversation to have, and they have it a little bit in this movie, although I think it gets a little muddied by some of the things that go on. But maybe that's appropriate, because like art is messy and messaging is messy and audience reactions is messy. So it's kind of true to life. So also from the section you mentioned how Enid at one point says, like, I'm going to be your own personal dating service. I'm going to hook you up with somebody. And they start going through this behavior where she's trying to find him a match. And we get a couple interesting scenes. One, they go to the sex shop, which is right out of the comic, although Seymour has been swapped for Josh here. But it plays out in a similar way. Although, I think the implications are a little different when the two of them are walking into the sex shop together than they were when Josh was doing it. And then we get the scene in the bar with Blues Hammer, which was a very on the nose sort of satirical moment. It was pretty funny though. Like a bunch of these, like they hate this like actual authentic blues musician who's there that Seymour is there to see. And then he goes off stage and Blues Hammer takes over in some really racist song that all these white guys are singing and performing, and everybody's super into it, right? It's such a commentary on the modern culture of the time, right?
Yeah. And again, kind of like appropriation,
Totally.
like, and like that scene was pretty rough. I think it's darkly funny, but at the same time, I'm like, this is so fucked up right now that specifically the lyrics too. I was like, damn, I don't.
Well, and it was like they were oblivious to it. Clearly, I think, just adopting it to be popular, I guess.
We're meant to think that this is a cover, right?
I don't know. It might have been an original song.
Either way, it's bad. I just, yeah.
Also, just an interesting moment between Seymour and this woman who Enid sends over essentially to talk to him, where he actuallys her about the music and just like goes off talking about the specific subgenre of music it is, and she's not very excited about that. But then of course she gets up and she's dancing to this Blues Hammer stuff, so like clearly she wasn't the one for him. But I don't know, it's just a pretty funny moment, the idea of like him, like he can't help himself. He has to just like go into his like extreme knowledge about this particular subject. And it's true that in life you'll find people who like will be into that, and you'll find people who are not into it. And he said that thing earlier about how like he doesn't like his own hobbies, and he like wants somebody who doesn't like him. But like I don't know that that's true, and I think evidenced by this moment at the bar, because she's not into what he's into, and yet that matters to him in this moment when he kind of acted like it wasn't going to matter.
I think it's just a wall that he's built up, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's a self-preservation thing that he's realized like he needs to almost like maybe that's a bit of like the Enid in him that like he's looking at everything, he's saying like even the things I like, whatever, I shouldn't like them because they're not cool or whatever. In his heart of hearts he does, but he like his outward facing self he feels is more like approachable or easier to love if he like kind of seems like he isn't as into them.
But yeah, I mean, both Enid and Seymour constantly act like nobody understands them and that they're kind of these islands, but at the same time, they're completely shunning these two incredible people who do love them despite all of that and despite how smug and cynical they can both be. Enid with Becky and Seymour with Dana. And it's really interesting to see it play out. And at the end, I was really sad at the end. When they show, I guess I might be jumping ahead, but when they show the very end when he's in the therapist's office, I was just, that's heartbreaking.
Let's jump to that, I think.
Yeah. When Enid's poster is displayed at an art show, school officials find it so offensive they force Roberta to give her a failing grade and revoke the scholarship. Enid turns to Seymour for solace, resulting in a drunken one-night stand. Seymour breaks up with Dana and is called to account at work when the Cook's Chicken poster, previously something more racist, is publicized in a local newspaper. He unsuccessfully tries to contact Enid, only for Rebecca to tell him about Enid's prank phone call, describing the way they mocked him at the diner. Seymour is upset and goes to the convenience store where Josh works. Another customer ends up in a violent confrontation with Seymour, resulting in his being injured and hospitalized. Enid visits him in the hospital to apologize. After everything that has occurred, Enid gives in to her childhood fantasy of running away from home and disappearing. She has seen an old man, Norman, continually waiting at an out-of-service bus stop for a bus that will never come. Finally, as Enid watches from across the street, Norman boards an out-of-service bus. The next day, while Seymour discusses the summer's events with his therapist, Enid returns to the bus stop and boards the out-of-service bus when it arrives.
Okay, before we get into all this, just one more thought about the art stuff before we completely leave it behind. The Blues Hammer Band doing something quite racist with what they're doing and appropriating this the blues and the sort of narrative that this song is seeming to tell, but celebrated, right? Celebrated by society, it seems like. And then Enid has a similar situation where she has, you could argue, appropriated something and using it as art, and she is condemned. So maybe the movie's trying to say something about like what is deemed offensive and what is accepted, and maybe how there is, I don't know, something going on with the intentionality behind it, and like, I don't know, like it's hypocritical at times, and not enforced, I guess, equally across different mediums. I don't know, but it seems like the movie is trying to say something with that. Okay, we can move on. Let's move into this next part, because I love to see Norman come from the comic here, the man who's waiting for the bus that never comes. This becomes very important for the end of both the comic and here. So we set him up first, so he can be important at the end. And then their relationship sort of starts to hit rocks and become hit like a rocky patch. And Seymour is becoming more and more serious with Dana, which is making Enid uncomfortable. She doesn't see her as a good fit. And then they hook up, and I want to talk about this because I think this is like the crux of the movie. It's the climax of the movie in some ways, and it's also just like a really fascinating, I think, moment to sort of pick apart. So, like, what is your read on this relationship, them hooking up, and then it, like, right after it happens, I think importantly changes immediately, right? Like, an Enid sort of ghosts him in the modern parlance. And is no longer returning his calls, and she immediately, seems to view this as a mistake. And what does that mean?
I think that once they actually started hanging out, it was inevitable in a way. It was kind of like that, Fleabag hot priest relationship where
great show, excellent show,
great show. Yeah. But it's like you're just heading down the path, and I think at least on Enid's end, a lot of it comes less from like a promise for the future and more of a, exploring a question. And, the minute she tries it on, she realizes this isn't for me, immediately, even as they're like cuddling in bed right after, does not want this at all anymore.
I talked about last week how I felt like their inexperience in the way that they approached the world was naive, obviously. And I think, as far as I can tell in the story, I think that they talk about their virginity and they talk about sexuality a lot. But my interpretation is that she was a virgin here. Don't know for sure. That's just kind of how I've interpreted it. And I think that like that is like another sort of step towards adulthood that possibly happens here. And the way that she sees like him and that whole buildup and everything that's gone on, she sees him as the right kind of person for her, but then right after realizes, this isn't for me, and she was at a low point that she possibly like acted emotionally based on what was going on with Rebecca, and just how she was kind of jealous of the relationship with Dana and how things were going smoothly for Seymour, when in her life everything was the opposite of that. It was chaotic.
Yeah, it's so complicated because whether or not she was, I think this is the first brush with what would have been a very adult relationship if she had pursued it, in which I think quickly, because like for her, I think it is a very much like in the moment, she wants the undivided attention of Seymour. She wants the affection from Seymour. She wants to feel validated by him. But then after that is over, I think that is all she really wanted, and she realizes that, whereas he is now like, okay, I'm going to break up with Dana, we're going to get together, she's going to move in with me, were you serious when you were talking about that? And she's like, oh no, I was just kind of, spitballing. But he is like taking that to be a thing that she essentially promised to him, and he's like all about it now. And I think in a way that is understandable for him. And he sort of tragically is pursuing it. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I think you could also view her actions as selfish and destructive, because she says, you got this thing with Dana and I don't want to fuck that up, when she's there. And I'm like, I don't believe you, because it seems to me that this was in a way designed to fuck that up. Like she didn't approve of that relationship. And I think she wanted to feel like what they had was more valuable. And then after she sort of, I don't know, you could argue maybe sort of manipulates the situation to play out that way. Not that he wasn't, a full participant in it. But she plays the hand in making it go as far as it does. Now she's able to just walk away, and she's just basically dropped a bomb on his life, right? And this relationship. Now maybe it was for the best. I think the movie sort of implies that she maybe was having an inappropriate relationship with somebody at work. At least that seemed to be the way the camera was lingering on, the way they were like hugging or something, like this other guy at the real estate office. So maybe we're left to believe that this was going to be a doomed relationship anyway, and he's better for not being in it. But that's a lot. I don't know. I'm not sure, because in some ways she seemed like she was a good fit for him, right? And it was a stability, and it was providing something that seemed to be good for him in his life, and gets blown up in this moment. So I don't know. It's a complicated situation, and I don't really know how to feel about it.
It's interesting because a lot of people kind of interpreted at the end Enid getting on the bus and leaving as apparently her dying by suicide. Which
I did hear that.
I thought was I had never heard of that take until I was clicking around today and like looking at things. I certainly don't see it that way, but I do understand how people can interpret it that way, because Enid does kind of drop a bomb on every single person. She tells Becky that she's going to move in with her and doesn't. She tells Seymour she's going to move in with him and be in a relationship with him, and he breaks up with his girlfriend, and then she doesn't. And even the micro things like the relationship with her father and the father's girlfriend and the art school teacher, it's just she doesn't really leave anything for the better. And I didn't interpret it that way, but I did interpret it as her thinking that it would be better if she just kind of leaves town and starts over again somewhere else. And I totally understand that instinct of wanting to have a fresh start.
She can kind of use all of the experiences she has here, where she's seemingly blown up her life and the relationships there, to be the person that she wants to be and grow into, and like have a fresh start in that way. I did see that online, and Clowes actually has replied to it since, and he said, quote, "Yeah, it could be. It's hard to figure out why people have that response. The first time I heard it, I said, what? You're out of your mind. What are you talking about? But I've heard that hundreds of times." Zwigoff expanded on his views in a 2021 interview saying, quote, "Many interpreted it to mean Enid died by suicide. I personally thought of the ending as more positive, that she's moving on with her life, that she had faith in herself." And then Birch, who plays Enid, actually said, "Honestly, it's a sad film to me. I have a very dark view of where that story is leading, unfortunately." So yeah, kind of a mixed bag. And that's ambiguous storytelling in general, right? Like, you have an ending like this, and it's meant to be interpreted so that we can have this conversation. And I think you can read it either way, because ultimately that character that's seemingly going nowhere on that bus has never come by. I just totally see the metaphor there of that being like her death.
It seems to be like something magical, right? Because there's not supposed to be a bus line, and yet he's able to get on the bus and leave. And then she catches seemingly the same bus. It shows up, it's empty except for like a faceless driver. They're the only person on the bus. You leave town. So I can see why people look at this and say like, oh, this means something. This isn't like literally happening. This is a metaphor for her committing suicide. Whether or not it's that, I can see it. I definitely see it as like this end of one life, right? It's the end of her life here. And she's going on to something unknown. And moving on to, the afterlife, of course, is like the ultimate unknown, but also just within our world, if you were to leave everyone you knew and loved behind and go to another place, it would be as if you died, in some ways. So I think the two are actually closer together than they might seem on the surface, right? Like, one seems like so dramatically different. But it is certainly like a kind of death for the character as she's leaving. And yeah, she has blown up everything. And so I get also what Birch said there about it being a dark story, because I don't know to me, like, because James, you mentioned that you kind of viewed it as this positive. I don't know. I think I'm kind of with Birch on it. Like, it feels like maybe something good is out there for her, but her way of handling everything here has sort of destroyed everything. And I guess it depends on whether or not we think she can grow from that into something new, into a different kind of person who is able to be more authentic with her life, versus someone who is still going to have trouble connecting with people.
I also think there's something, and maybe it's not the healthiest thing to do, but at that age, run away and then maybe at some point reconcile with these relationships. And once you've had more life experience in some way, but I could see the character doing that, and like I don't know, it's both, right? It's a terrible probably headspace to be in when you leave your family and friends and everyone behind in a bad light, but then at the same time you get to start anew. So yeah, it does play somewhat positive to me there. Either way, I like that it's left to interpretation, which, like, I was watching with my fiance and she was like, I don't know how I feel about the ending. And I was like, well, let's talk about it a little bit. So we went back and forth some. And I think by the end of the conversation, after talking about the comic and kind of what I was thinking, she said she liked it, but she still felt it was a bit ambiguous for her. So, to each their own.
I think I saw it more as a, this is going to sound so cheesy, but I saw it more of a rebirth rather than a death, like a ego death. Yeah, because I mean, she's so young. She's at a transitional part of her life for everyone right there. Right? She just got out of high school and now she has to enter the, like, all right, what do I do now? Like, how do I make money? Where am I going to live? What do I want to do? What am I going to do to get there? And that's kind of how I see it, is she's seeing where she doesn't fit in. And she keeps kind of like saying that in the movie, where she says that she likes Seymour because he embodies everything she doesn't hate, but she never says what she likes what she likes about him.
Well, and she kind of realizes that she actually doesn't like him that much. Like, she likes him, I guess, but not enough to stay with him, right? Like, as soon as she gets it, she's like, actually, this is not what I want. So then it's left with, like, what does she want? And I don't think the movie provides an answer, but maybe she will be able to find something. Is the hope.
Exactly.
Yeah, I like that. I think we can all agree we're glad that it doesn't say to art school on the side of the bus as they're driving away. What's funny is I was going to make the same joke, Luke. I was going to say, do we wish that there was a double wedding at the end? I mean, I think so. We all would love that, right? Tied up with a nice bow.
Oh my
no,
gosh.
I love, me, I like ambiguous endings. So I think it's cool that we can have this conversation about it. And that, all these years later, even in ways that the filmmaker didn't intend, clearly, and I think it holds up. And I think there is something to that idea of suicide. I think you can read it that way. On
a lighter note, there is one more scene that we have to talk about before we close out here. My favorite scene in the movie was when she got the job at the movie theater.
Oh, yeah.
And I worked at movie theaters in high school and in college. And this the upselling, do you want butter? Ew, for the butter. All of this stuff was so funny to me. The way that the manager was it's very
it's not optional.
And at the same time, like there's still a part of me to this day that's like, I don't know, capitalism. That level of capitalism just feels gross. Sure. And like seeing a character like Enid engage with that, I think is like, of course we wanted to see that. We wanted to see her engage with like the day-to-day, know.
And she's uncompromising, right? Like, she's not willing to compromise on her ideals, which is appealing, but also causes a lot of problems for her in her life. And also when he said, like, go open your own theater, I'm like, oh, maybe that's what you should do, Enid. That sounds kind of cool.
Not a bad idea.
But yeah, I think they visually showed that too, with like, I don't know if you kind of noticed, but like as the movie goes on, they show more and more like strip malls. And like at the end when she's like walking down the street, it's just like, I think it's in the Valley, and I think it's on Ventura Boulevard, where it's just like Radio Shack and like a Baskin Robbins and just like every single store you could think of, like Las Vegas style, lit up.
Yeah, and mostly empty too, right? Because we talked about very, very few extras in the background. I love that final shot with the bus drives up, because above her as she's waiting on the bench, there's all those apartments with the blue glow coming out of the windows. I noticed, which was a reference directly to the start of the movie and back to the comics. But Before we weigh in on what we thought was better, I do want to touch in on one last time on Becky and her relationship, because there is a final moment where they get together and have like a tender moment with each other, talk about how they're going to, I think they said they're going to like meet up again later, but this was like an interesting moment because it felt like important, but not as important as it was in the comic, which we had talked about, right? Like their relationship wasn't as much at the heart of this movie as it was in the comic.
So that actually in the comic was the thing that really touched me, and it had me thinking about like, you know, friendships that sort of just like lapsed as time went on. And so like to lose that, I felt like lost like a layer there. But yeah, I think in this sense it because we don't get that like epilogue sort of chapter where they kind of cross paths, and you know that they're not actually going to reconnect. You can kind of assume, I think, in this version that they will reconnect.
We don't see her actually with Josh in this version, do we? Yeah, I was like waiting for that to be revealed, but it never was.
I kind of read the ending this time watching it. I don't know if it's because the transition between the fight to Steve Buscemi being in the hospital was so jarring, but the scene between him and Enid and the final scene between Becky and Enid almost felt like a fantasy, like something that Enid was imagining, because it felt very, you know, wrapped up in a little bow. Everybody forgives her. She gets to show that, you know, Seymour is actually her hero. And
yeah, you're right. It was like kind of remarkably, like Becky was really forgiving of what Enid had done in a way that was almost unusual. Yeah. Hey, that's more fuel for the suicide theory, I think.
Maybe. But it could also just be that, you know, Becky knew that her friend was leaving and didn't want to leave on a bad note.
Yeah, and was just forgiving in that moment. Yeah, so we have to come to a conclusion here at the end. We traditionally, James and I will go first and you will vote last. We're going to vote comic versus movie here, what we preferred. James, you want to start things off?
Sure. As I tend to do, I'm going to take the movie here. And I think, like I said, there's a layer that really affected me in the comic that doesn't exist in this movie. But that being said, I think the performances are iconic. And I think that you get like Buscemi, you get Birch, and you get Scarlett Johansson, and they just like give performances that for like most of the, like Birch, for example, like I only knew from like Halloween, what was it, Hocus Pocus, and what was the other thing I'd seen her in?
American Beauty.
American Beauty, yeah. It definitely, she fits so well in that, and then Buscemi as like this strange kind of love interest, and then Scarlett Johansson very early on. It's a lot of fun to see them, and I think that the film does a lot to evoke what the comic's intention was. And I think on the podcast often that's what we're looking for, is like what was important to the tone and the themes. And I think they nailed both of those things, even though that like plot wise there's so many changes that come into effect. And I'm sure Clowes being as involved as he was helped this along to a good adaptation. But that's not always the case. You know, when the writers are involved, sometimes it's just like there's an issue with the adaptation. But yeah, I mean, they clearly were able to like create something that is lasted. There's like I said before, that it was nominated for an Academy Award. It's got a Criterion release. I love the look of the film. I love like the kind of capsule version, like time capsule that I talked about that this film it represents for me. And not like the super popular ones that are just like general high school movies. Like this like felt like I felt a kinship with this because it touched on a lot of the things that I was feeling, and it's like a bit more intense than your run of the mill like teenage story. So I think that this movie would have been like my favorite movie at the time period that it came out and when I was a kid. I regret that I didn't get to see it at that time, but thank you, Jasmine, for bringing it to our attention.
So you're taking the movie?
Yeah, I said that at the beginning.
Yeah. Just being sure. Yeah, I had a similar experience with this movie as I did with the book, in the sense that I at first wasn't sure how much I was going to like it, and then it kind of grew on me over time, and thinking about it after the fact even like helped me like continue to appreciate it. So I think for me, where it's going to come down, because both are really fascinating in their own way. We talked about how they achieve their aims through the different mediums in really cool ways. The book felt a lot more about Enid and her friendship with Becky and her relationship to men and her romance as like a piece of her life as part of a larger issue that she was having with connecting with society. The movie feels a lot more focused on the romantic aspects of her life as a metaphor, or maybe like a manifestation of that frustration she's having with society. And both of them engage with those in ways that sometimes hasn't aged well, sometimes was a bit maybe awkward or I don't know, imprecise. And I didn't always like jive with. But overall, I ended up liking them both quite a bit. But I am going to choose the comic because I thought that sort of more rounded story and the focus on a friendship, I found to be personally a little more interesting. And then at the same time, I was just completely taken with the art style and the storytelling that Clowes was able to deploy here. And I don't know, I really ended up having a lot of affection for this comic after finishing it. So even though it's closer than I suspected, I think I am going to go with the comic. All right, so you got a tie break now, Jasmine.
This is a close one for me because they are, even though some of the scenes are almost exactly the same, they are so different, and they explore the same themes very differently. But I think I'm gonna go with the comic because I do really love the focus on Enid and Becky's relationship, and I think that kind of nuanced female friendship isn't seen a ton. And I did like how they had these really strange, quirky girls without making them that, manic pixie dream girl stereotype. And they, not that they weren't really like that in the movie too, but I don't know, there's just so much growth. There's so much growth in the graphic novel. And especially, about halfway through, you really see Enid start to change. And I liked the stakes that the potentially going to college threw in there for their friendship. So yeah, I think I'm going to go with the comic.
All right. Cool. Comics are going to outweigh you this time, James.
That's okay, yeah. I mean, rightfully so. I thought, as you were both talking about the comic, I also was thinking about some of those quieter moments, just those frames that like you can linger on at the end of issues. And it's very emotional. I think the comic does a great job of really exploring many different aspects of the story.
So here at the end, Jasmine, we want to thank you for coming on, but could you let our listeners know if they wanted to connect with you online? Do you have any social media accounts that you'd like for people to know about, or any, maybe you could talk about upcoming work, things like that?
Yeah. I'm on Twitter, X, it's Jasmine Amiri, and then same for Instagram. So currently I'm, the graphic novels editor at SLJ. So I'm also constantly doing like book roundups. And actually tomorrow I get to interview Tegan and Sarah, which I'm so excited about.
Whoa, that's awesome. So cool.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just, if you check our website out, you'll see stuff from me every now and then. And then also the book I'm editing right now, it's called Hardstyle Juice, and it's a wrestling murder mystery.
Who's that by?
So that's from Clay McCormick and Ricardo Ortiz. And yeah, it's such a fun, bright, vivid comic.
And I see your Mankind shirt on, so that you're referencing
the
wrestling. Love that.
I'm a big wrestling fan. But yeah, so that's on Comixology right now. And you can get issues 1 through... I think issue 4 might come out this week or next week. So yeah.
Cool. We'll have links to all of that in the show notes, so you can find that. But thank you so much for coming on. This has been really cool.
Yeah. Thank you for having me. It's so fun.
Thanks, Jasmine.
So if you're on YouTube and you enjoyed this episode, let us know in the comments. Let us know your thoughts on the suicide theory and whether or not you agree with it. And if you enjoyed our coverage overall for Ghost World and you are listening on audio, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. That helps the show continue to grow.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink2Film.
Also TikTok, Blue Sky. I have a presence on Threads. We're all over the place. If you would like to support this podcast in another way, we do have a Patreon, and we would love to have your support on there. That's the thing that keeps us going, honestly. And we have bonus content on there that we release every month. So you can get access to that, and we have other tiers, other rewards. So check that out, patreon.com/inktofilm.
And thank you to Russ Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, that's going to be it for our Ghost World coverage. Thank you so much for listening and for watching on YouTube. We appreciate you, and until next time.
Keep adapting.